Chris was bored. He was literally fed up with everything. Sitting at the far table at one of the capital's trendy nightclubs, he sipped whiskey lazily and watched the crowd. His eyes lingered on the beauties prowling near his cosy leather sofa. "Don't you miss me, cowboy?" A sultry brunette paused nearby, with long black bushy eyelashes and a short haircut. Thick dark eyeliner framed her impressive eyes. Judging by her dilated pupils, she'd had plenty of cocktails, maybe even something stronger. She gazed at Chris invitingly, but he removed her clutching fingers with their long red nails from his shoulder. Such flashy women weren't his style. Despite his wealthy background, he preferred intellectuality and quiet dignity in women. He gestured for this volcanic creature in her short skirt to move along. He wouldn't waste time on such pettiness. All these one-night stands were meaningless. That phase of his life was over. Now he sought women he could proudly take to the theatre, introduce to his friends, and eventually to his parents, who kept pressuring him to present a suitable partner. Suddenly, Chris realised he couldn't stand another minute in the club. As he pushed through the heated throng, he pondered. This monotonous Groundhog Day exhausted him. Days filled with office work, because his parents insisting a man must build his own career. Meaningless lunch conversations with colleagues over coffee and pizza. Evenings at fancy restaurants and bohemian gatherings with fellow heirs to power. His position demanded all this, because social etiquette and business connections couldn't be ignored. Outside, Chris inhaled the spicy scents of golden autumn with relief. He longed to shuffle through fallen leaves, to sit quietly in a park under a solitary street lamp, free from conversation, pretense, and the masks required by different situations. Didn't he have the right to tire of all this pomp and circumstance? His mind drifted through his life story. Elite kindergarten, then gymnasium with dancing, fencing, foreign languages. He spoke German, French, and even Spanish fluently. Yet he still questioned the purpose of such a brilliant education. Was it just to help his girlfriends shop in Milan? To impress them with his sophistication? After graduating from a prestigious school, he had earned degrees in economics and law, and took a top position in his father's company, pleasing his parents. But to what end? Chris wasn't sure this was what he wanted. Walking through the nearest public garden, he realised he'd been hasty with walking. The Indian summer's warmth had yielded to evening's chill. The icy wind cut through his jacket, t-shirt and jeans, biting to the bone. Enjoy the autumn air longer? Or forget these whims, call a cab and hurry to his warm bachelor pad? Chris knew he couldn't endure the cold much longer, so he reached for his phone, but suddenly heard muffled crying behind the bushes. Following the sorrowful sobs, he found a hunched female figure on a bench behind a lush exotic plant with burgundy leaves and mysterious berries. He couldn't guess her age at first glance. Her crying was inconsolable. She seemed not only to sob, but to shiver from cold, whimpering like an abandoned puppy. Chris touched her shoulder gently. She looked up at him with tear-filled grey eyes, her delicate nose wrinkled. She tried to speak, but another wave of hysteria overwhelmed her. The man wrinkled his nose slightly. He couldn't stand that kind of emotional display. What could have made her cry so desperately? Chris made another attempt to comfort the woman. "Is something wrong? How can I help?" The woman fixed her gaze on him and abruptly stopped sobbing. She spoke almost calmly, surprising Chris with her ability to switch moods at lightning speed. "Help me find that unscrupulous thief who picked my purse while I was riding the subway. It's not just about the purse itself. That wasn't worth much. But I had all my documents in a bright bag, with Santa Claus and reindeer printed on it. My passport, diploma, and the address of someone here who was supposed to take me in. I have nothing left. Will you help me track down this scoundrel?" Chris laughed heartily. "You women are quite resourceful. I thought you'd drown me in tears, but here you are, cheerful already. Let's introduce ourselves. I'm Chris." "And I'm Tomiko." He nearly choked. Tomiko? I've never heard a name like that before. Who came up with it? "I don't remember much of my childhood, Chris. It's a long story, and I don't have time to tell it now. I need to find somewhere to sleep. Train station waiting rooms aren't an option, and I don't have enough money anyway. I'll wait until dawn and figure something out. Thank you for stopping to ask. See, I've even stopped crying. It's cold. You should head home. As for me, I'll manage." Chris was surprised again, this time by her courage rather than her swift emotional changes. He was always quick to make decisions, so without hesitation, he invited this desperate, shivering stranger to his place. Her reaction was unpredictable. She protested. "Do you take in every stray puppy or kitten? I'm like a stray dog right now, unwanted, lost. Why burden yourself? Tomorrow you'll sober up and regret your kindness. What then? Me back to the streets? I'll file a police report in the morning. They must have procedures for situations like this. I'm not helpless. I have my wits. I'll survive. I'll find work somehow." Chris wasn't used to women refusing him. He clarified that he wasn't proposing anything romantic, just offering shelter and food. Tomiko looked at him again with her large grey eyes and said, "All right, come on, Sir Knight, or whatever you are. You'll catch a cold." They arrived safely at his luxurious apartment, stopping at a supermarket where Chris bought 2 huge bags of groceries. At the apartment it became clear Chris had indeed caught a cold. The woman made him take a hot shower and drink tea with raspberry jam she found on the shelf. Once he fell into troubled sleep, she kept busy. With his permission, she settled in, arranging her few belongings on an assigned shelf, placing her modest toiletries in the bathroom, setting her toothbrush in a glass. She soaked in a warm, fragrant bath, then went to the kitchen to prepare a hearty chicken broth for Chris. Finding flour, sugar and butter in the pantry, she decided that they would have her specialty pancakes for breakfast. Tomiko loved cooking, but rarely had the chance to share her talent. The next day was Saturday. Fortunately, Chris didn't have to rush to work. He woke up in the afternoon, clear-headed and refreshed. In the bathroom, he found a few feminine products and a bright orange toothbrush with a dragon on it. Once again, he replayed Friday night and evening in his head, remembering nothing about bringing home another random girlfriend, though this time felt different. This girl seemed unusual. On the kitchen table sat a stack of fluffy pancakes. A pot of still warm chicken broth waited on the stove. The man smiled happily, remembering how his mother used to make him broth and halved hard-boiled eggs. There were also crispy croutons, freshly made from bread from the local bakery. Chris poured himself a bowl of the amber liquid, grabbed a pancake and closed his eyes in bliss. Real home cooking. His socialite mother now left everything to the hired cooks. He couldn't recall ever seeing her wearing an apron in the kitchen. Money changes people, making them conform to their social circle's expectations. Savouring his breakfast-lunch hybrid, Chris went looking for the cook who had prepared such a feast, finding her in the living room. His memory returned right away. The girl, and in daylight he could see just how young she was, slept peacefully on the corner sofa, facing a muted TV. Chris smiled at what was playing, an old Tom and Jerry cartoon, where the cat battled mischievous mice. The girl slept soundly. The tear-stained creases on her face had smoothed out, and a faint smile played on her lips. In her dreams, no one had yet managed to hurt her. Everything was peaceful. Chris took the opportunity to study Tomiko more closely. Her full lips were well defined, and a healthy blush coloured her cheeks. She had gone to bed with wet hair, and now the unruly blonde strands lay scattered across the velvet couch cushion. Used to flashier women, Chris had never encountered such serene beauty. He liked what he saw. When Tomiko suddenly stretched and opened her eyes, she looked around anxiously at first, but upon seeing Chris she relaxed. She asked immediately, "Did you find breakfast? I couldn't think of anything else." "Thank you. I've eaten well. Go wash and have a snack. Then meet me here in the living room. You promised to tell me your story. We need to decide how I can help you." The girl followed his instructions without protest. She came back rosy and satisfied. She carried a tray with 2 cups of coffee and a plate of cookies. "I've taken the liberty of serving you. You don't mind, do you?" she inquired. Chris watched her movements with amusement. Usually, his overnight guests rushed to the bathroom in the morning to reapply their makeup, then casually announced they would like to have coffee and something to eat. They were too confident in their allure, believing their charms would transform Chris into either a servant or a devoted admirer. Tomiko seemed unfamiliar with such affectations. She quietly took her seat, bit into a cookie naturally, and sipped her coffee while explaining, "I found a Turkish coffee pot in the cupboards and decided to make coffee the traditional way. My foster father, who loves everything Oriental, taught me the proper technique. I also found some sugar and cardamom. I hope you don't mind me taking such liberties." "No problem at all, and I'm ready to listen to you," he said. "I'm 27, the young girl replied promptly, though everyone thinks I'm 5 years younger. I managed to get married at 18. It lasted a month before the romance bubble burst, and we went back to our separate student dormitories." Moving the cookie plate closer to Chris, Tomiko continued, "I can bake cookies just as good as these. My foster mum is a pastry chef. Our house always had 2 distinct aromas: Turkish coffee made on sand and sweet pastries with vanilla and cinnamon. Those scents defined my childhood and adolescence. The people who raised me never loved me too much. They were always absorbed in their professional pursuits, which I must respect. Don't pity me. I accepted their choice long ago. I've lived independently for almost 10 years now, in a different city. In our seemingly perfect family, I never understood why my parents never developed maternal and paternal feelings. I never learned how I came to their small, cosy house by the waterfront. It's a small town, with buildings scattered along both banks of a modest but picturesque river. Everyone knows each other, yet I never heard any gossip at school or on the streets. I doubt the neighbours even knew I was adopted. My parents matter-of-factly told me about my adoption when I was 10. The news didn't devastate me. I had always sensed they were merely fulfilling a social obligation. They weren't unkind, but they didn't love me. To be fair, they invested considerable effort in my education. I speak Chinese well and understand Japanese and Korean. My adoptive father, an enthusiast of all things Asian, understands Oriental traditions, customs and authentic practices. He and my mother frequently travelled to the East, leaving me with a nanny. My parents lived off a decent inheritance they'd taken from their parents. They managed their finances carefully, living modestly without extravagance. When Mum tired of travelling, she stayed home, baking cakes, pastries, cookies, and cupcakes for a bakery. She's truly skilled, though I haven't visited in years, not since leaving for studies after school. So what path did you choose, Chinese or cookies? Chris asked without irony. Tomiko wasn't easily flustered. Like Flint, she merely smiled indulgently. I'm a fitness trainer. I was seriously involved in tennis until I got a hand injury at age 17. A bad fall on the ice. I couldn't imagine a worse fracture for tennis. I'd been a star in the sport before, but it ended as it ended. Chris immediately looked her over with a keen masculine eye. Even in a spacious t-shirt and breeches, it was noticeable that Tomiko was well built. When she started to move, Grace complimented her already graceful figure. How could he not have seen all this yesterday when he was so drunk? He had only seen and heard sobs and tears. He had met a sophisticated woman, with a sharp mind and refined upbringing. In his parents' neighbourhood, the younger generation were all puppets. Whatever string the puppeteer pulled, that's how they would behave. All the girls looked as if they had stepped off fashion magazine covers, cloned in beauty salons. At social gatherings, they behaved with affected perfection, while in nightclubs, they became disposable personalities. His parents' desire for him to marry into a high-ranking family caused him persistent rejection. He was already sick of their sour faces and questions. "Son, when are you going to introduce us to your girlfriend?" Now, here was a woman from another world sitting in front of him. At their parties, they would have treated her like an exotic specimen. But Chris was enjoying. She was natural and genuine. There she was, eating cookies one after another without lamenting about diets or calorie counting. Chris's musings were interrupted by insistent doorbell ringing. He definitely hadn't invited guests this Saturday. Who could be surprising him? Unfortunately, Chris couldn't have imagined a worse scenario for this weekend. His parents stood on the doorstep with numerous packages. Their arrival at his city apartment with such supplies meant a long visit. Chris's mother started talking before he could say a word. "Sonny, we missed you so much. We have tickets for tonight's performance of The Marriage of Figaro, so I hope you won't mind if we stay at your place for the night. I don't want to drive back through traffic jams." With this long tirade, Deborah entered the living room, where she continued to devour Tomiko's cookies with an innocent look. Chris's mother's eyes widened. She hadn't expected to see such a cute creature in an oversized bunny t-shirt, but she came to her senses right away and went on the offensive. "Chris, introduce us to this lovely young lady. I see everything here is quite casual and homely today." The young man gestured, warning to Tomiko to stay quiet, and proudly announced, "Meet my fiancée, Tomiko. Yesterday we filed our marriage application at the registry office." Deborah nearly fainted theatrically, clutching her head as she fell into a chair. "Chris, these jokes are inappropriate. A fiancée is almost a wife. What will people say when there hasn't even been an official engagement? You're embarrassing us throughout the capital." Tomiko didn't even flinch with all the unfolding scene. She continued sipping her cooled coffee nonchalantly, then stunned Chris with her playful remark, "Honey, do you mind if I finish your coffee too? I still have some cookies left, and I don't want to eat them dry." Chris mentally applauded his new acquaintance. No one had ever shocked his mother quite like that. When she had recovered somewhat, Tomiko kindly offered them food, mentioning there was fresh chicken broth, boiled chicken, and pancakes with sour cream, though not much remained. Later, Tomiko couldn't explain to Chris what had come over her. She justified it by saying she had seen such pleading in his eyes to help him, if she had read his silent requests correctly. Meanwhile, Deborah, recovering from her shock, suddenly agreed to eat and headed to the kitchen, hoping to find evidence of bachelor chaos. But she was disappointed. While preparing the broth, Tomiko had tidied the whole kitchen. She'd even managed to wash and dry the light curtains in the washing machine. The young woman didn't know how else to thank Chris, so she did what she did best. Since age 15, when her foster parents had entrusted her with cleaning house and yard, she had been skilled with mop, rake, shovel, and vacuum cleaner. They all first ate dinner in sepulchral silence. Only the living room clock's ticking could be heard. Then the oppressive quiet was broken by Chris's father, speaking for the first time that evening. "Tomiko, would you mind serving me more broth? Your broth is so rich and flavourful, truly homemade, not artificial." Everyone at the table suddenly became animated. They engaged in pleasant small talk. Then Chris's father called him to the balcony for a man-to-man chat over cigarettes. Once the door closed, he was frank. "Chris, you invented this marriage story for your mother's benefit, of course. You can't fool me. A woman like that won't marry you. You're clearly from different worlds, it's obvious. And even if Tomiko does marry you, she won't last. You're not the homely, sweet type. That's precisely what she seems to be. A simple, sincere woman. We'll discuss this later. We won't stay tonight under these circumstances. I'm taking your mum home before she gets more upset. Think it over, son. Don't do anything foolish. You won't manage with such a wife." Chris's anger flared. So that's what his father thought of him. He grabbed his father's jacket sleeve. "Let's bet that I'll live with Tomiko, not just for a month, but for life. Are you willing to bet on that?" Edward studied his offspring intently, as if seeing him anew, then suddenly grew animated. "Let's bet. If you marry Tomiko and live harmoniously for at least a month, I'll give your family a substantial portion of my company's shares. If you last longer and give us grandchildren, I'll transfer the entire controlling interest to you. Those are high stakes. You'll become more than our son. You'll be head of a major holding company. Consider it carefully." In the theatre, Deborah could not sit still. Even the brilliant performance of the actors failed to distract her from her thoughts. Perhaps it was the news of Chris's marriage that had her so agitated. Deborah was meticulous about maintaining her status. Society's opinion of her family's impeccability was paramount to her, and now this unexpected turn. What was she to think? During intermission, Deborah surprised her husband with a question. "Darling, would it be terribly improper if we went to the cafeteria and you got me a glass of cognac? My nerves are rather frayed." The strong drink didn't bring clarity to her thoughts, but she watched the second act with pleasure, barely distracted by her concerns. On the way home, she shared her worries with her husband. Edward didn't see his son's wedding as a drama and quickly calmed his wife. "The woman made a pleasant impression on me. Perhaps we'll finally have grandchildren." "But she's not our kind," Deborah parried. "Come now, how long ago was it that you yourself became a lady of society? Have you forgotten how we started? By the way, why not invite your son and his fiancée to our country mansion? You can observe the young lady within our walls. Teach her our unspoken rules. You can't silence all your girlfriends and their daughters. Let them adjust to the fact that one of society's most eligible bachelors is now taken." Deborah found her husband's proposal sensible. She would invite her son and daughter-in-law to the house under a plausible pretext, and then determine how to present Chris's marriage story to their circle. After all, it could be quite original. While everyone else displayed everything, they would stand apart, making the event mysterious, wrapped in an air of secrecy. Meanwhile, in Chris's city apartment, after his parents' visit, a battle was brewing. Tomiko had lost her earlier fighting spirit. She no longer felt pleased about getting involved in this unusual arrangement with Chris's parents. But the man kept persuading and encouraging her. "Why not play my wife for my parents and their acquaintances? We'll get your new documents sorted during this time. We can't go to the registry office without my passport anyway," Tomiko argued. "What are you talking about, Chris? What registry office? What kind of rich man's wife would I be? We're complete opposites in both fate and outlook. We'll never find common ground." Chris seized the opportunity to hear Tomiko's life story, reminding her they'd stopped on her profession as a fitness trainer. The young woman smiled wryly. "There's really nothing special to tell. After graduating, I returned to my adoptive parents' city out of habit. They were always travelling in the East, then spending hours looking at photos over my mum's cakes. I'd visit briefly, but have polite, distant conversations. Eventually, I stopped disturbing them. After a brief teenage marriage, I lived with someone in a rented apartment. It worked for us, two unattached people. Coming home to kitchen lights on and someone frying potatoes made life less lonely and cold. We didn't love each other, but we were comfortable and convenient. Not all couples unite because their souls meet in heaven. Chris gestured for her to stop, a question forming. What was wrong with him? Tomiko wrinkled her nose. You misunderstand. It wasn't about good or bad. That's just how some relationships are. We met strangely and parted strangely. The priority was having a normal partner during a lonely time. Do you really think men and women only get together over true feelings? That's naive. Often, people stay together because it's the best solution at that time. Work, daily life, or financial challenges might bind them. When those issues resolve and the gestalt completes, everyone moves on. Chris was surprised. This Tomiko was more complex than she first appeared, he thought. Her arguments, bold and intriguing. She clearly drew my attention. I must wait for my parents' reaction. Then it will be clear what my bet with Dad will turn into. A month of living together felt like an odd holiday. Monday through Friday, Tomiko worked on restoring her documents, while job hunting unsuccessfully. Fitness trainers were scarce in her provincial town, while the capital overflowed with such specialists from the regions. Her diploma confirmation remained pending. Each evening, Chris found home-cooked dinner waiting, plus a delicious new dessert for tea. He complained about gaining weight, but couldn't resist eating everything heartily. They maintained strict boundaries. Chris refused to exploit Tomiko's temporary vulnerability. A true hunter would avoid such prey. As for Tomiko, she could not imagine that he would not mind crossing the line. She faced so many complications, she didn't know where to begin untangling them. In her hometown, she'd quit her job, left her rented apartment. Her capital client, temporarily working in her town and taking Tomiko's fitness classes, had filled her head with ideas. Oh, Tomiko, what a marvel you are! It's a shame to waste such talent in the provinces. Your training makes me feel reborn. I can introduce you to all my contacts, build you a clientele among my friends, help you join a fitness club. I have many connections in the capital. You won't be homeless or penniless, so consider moving there. At that time, Tomiko had separated from her boyfriend, who had met his true love and married later. At work, clients were becoming scarce, not due to the quality of services provided. It was just her town was struggling with unemployment, downsizing, and bankruptcy. People barely had money for bread, let alone fitness training. Tomiko's adoptive parents hadn't called her for 2 months. They answered her calls, but remained distant, busy packing for another long trip to the east. They were far from their now-grown daughter. At her 27, they thought it was unreasonable to expect even a moral support from older relatives. That's how they had framed their position to her. Thus Tomiko was alone again, unwilling to burden married friends with pleas of, "Talk to me, listen to me, I'm tired of being needed by no one." Therefore the woman left for the capital without many hesitations. The capital decided to test her strength first. While she was dealing with the initial consequences of her decision, Chris appeared as if sent by Providence. He offered her a chance to pause and regroup. Among Chris's close friends was a document forger who created a fake marriage certificate, and a month after meeting his parents, Chris and Tomiko presented themselves as newlyweds to them. Though Tomiko initially resisted this charade, Chris convinced her. Neither woman in the family suspected his bet with his father. They opted against a lavish celebration at the mansion for Chris's marriage. Deborah cautiously explored her new role as mother-in-law, unsure how to carry this family title. She found it curious that the young couple didn't rush to the capital parties. Instead, the newlyweds followed a peaceful routine: breakfast outings, woodland walks, pool swims, courtyard lunches in the gazebo, and evening dinners with Edward and Deborah. Chris's father gave his son 2 weeks' vacation, allowing the new family to settle in. But Deborah would have been shocked to learn that the young couple slept separately. Chris's room had both a huge double bed and a corner sofa. Like a gentleman, he gave the choice to his fake wife. Tomiko chose the comfortable sofa, feeling uneasy about the bed. As a former athlete, Tomiko delighted in unlimited pool access, often swimming for hours. One day, an encounter with Deborah by the pool left her stunned. It was Monday, the very day when Chris had to go to work for the first time, so he was a little sad at breakfast, which didn't escape his mother's eyes. "My boy is truly in love. How surprising," Deborah thought, trying to overlook her true feelings. She refused to admit her growing fondness for Tomiko. It seemed impossible, yet watching her daughter-in-law closely revealed no flaws in her behaviour. She is attentive, caring, and affectionate with her husband, and she avoids the clingy behaviour of Chris's previous girlfriends. She never flaunts her position as the wealthy heir's wife. She attends to her husband quietly at meals. Yesterday she had even insisted on ironing his work shirt herself, shocking the maid. And she is always polite with us. By the way, her modest wardrobe needs updating. Her appearance needs some polishing. After seeing the men off to work, both women retired to their rooms. Tomiko hurried to don her swimsuit, because she eagerly wanted to swim. Meanwhile, Deborah, bored after gossiping with a friend about social news, considered joining her. Why not try the pool? It had been ages since she had exercised. She rummaged through her closet, found a swimsuit, put it on hastily, wrapped herself in a terry robe, and set off to observe her daughter-in-law. Entering the indoor pool area, she dropped her robe and towel over a chaise longue and approached the water's edge. Tomiko was clearly enjoying herself, snorting cheerfully as she dove and cut through the water with powerful strokes. She surfaced again, swimming close to her unsuspecting mother-in-law. As she turned, exposing her shoulder to Deborah, everything went dark in the woman's eyes. On the young woman's shoulder was an unmistakable birthmark, a perfect brown triangle, unique in its regularity. Tomiko heard only a loud splash, not immediately realizing that Deborah had fainted and fallen in. Miraculously, she hadn't hit her head or broken anything. Tomiko rushed to help. She managed to pull Deborah onto the top step before running for the maid's assistance, unable to lift the larger woman onto the chaise longue alone. Minutes later, Deborah opened her eyes. Seeing Tomiko above her, she startled as if facing a ghost. The frightened maid, never having seen her mistress in such a state, ran to call an ambulance. Tomiko clasped her mother-in-law's cold hand. "I'm here with you. The doctors will check for any injuries from your fall. If you can stand, I'll help you to your bedroom." Deborah's face was white as a sheet, as if all the blood had drained from it. She nodded silently to Tomiko that she would try to get up, but when the young woman took her by the waist, she jerked sharply away and whispered exhaustedly, "I'll manage myself. Go to your room. I want to be alone." Fortunately, when the ambulance arrived, they found no injuries. They noted her wild eyes, but attributed this to stress. After a hefty dose of sedatives, she fell into an uneasy sleep, missing dinner. Concerned by her strange behaviour, Edward found his wife in the bedroom, praying. His beloved wife seemed to have aged 20 years. The woman turned to him and whispered softly, "She found us. After 27 years. Our sin. Our mistake." Her husband was bewildered at first, then suddenly recoiled. "Who are you talking about?" Deborah mumbled exhaustedly. "About Tomiko. We just hadn't realized at once that it was she." Edward anxiously demanded, "What makes you think Tomiko has anything to do with that little girl?" Deborah whimpered, almost howling. "She came to me in my dreams. That birthmark on her back, the triangle, so distinct. It's grown and become even brighter. She's infiltrated our house to make us pay for our crime. And she's so calm, intelligent, sweet, but came to take our Chris, our own blood, away from us." Edward tried to reason with his wife. "They've only been together for 2 months. Our boy has changed dramatically in that time. He rarely goes out with friends anymore. Today at work, he completed an enormous amount of paperwork in record time. He surprised me at lunch with a container of small, obviously delicious pies. When I asked about them, he said Tomiko had woken up early while the cook was still resting to bake them for his business trip. Darling," his eyes shone with happiness, "think about this rationally. Perhaps Tomiko doesn't even know about us or her connection to us. Why assume she came for revenge? We should ask Chris how they met, whether their first meeting was planned. I can have my security team compile a complete dossier on our daughter-in-law. That might ease your mind." Deborah gazed at him with pained eyes and nodded silently. She said she would skip dinner. She needed solitude now, even from her soulmate, to revisit that terrible night's events. Deborah and Edward had been deeply in love, both charming, attractive, clever and spirited. Fresh university graduates full of hope. Edward had so impressed the company during his internship that they hired him without his father's influence, despite his father's high position. The job was promising, with good income prospects. Deborah had earned her degree mainly for prestige. As her middle-class parents had assured her, she could leave office work after marriage. They weren't nearly as wealthy then as now. Success and prosperity came much later. After their wedding, they honeymooned at the seacoast. For the occasion, Edward's father had given them his old car. Deborah had been so proud she could drive it too. Their 30 days by the sea passed like one. Returning to the capital, they took turns driving. Edward suggested avoiding night driving risks. They could rest in the next town and continue early morning when it was cooler. But Deborah, headstrong at 22, considering herself an expert driver, refused. They were driving along a virtually deserted road. The only approaching car suddenly began to swerve, heading straight toward Deborah and Edward's vehicle. A head-on collision seemed imminent, but at the last moment the driver of the other car jerked awake and turned the wheel. Though they avoided collision, the other car crashed into a tree by the roadside. The highway was empty. Deborah and Edward rushed to the crashed car with its smashed front, frantically trying to open the jammed driver's door. Eventually they managed to open it, though Deborah would later remember these moments only hazily. What they saw next was horrifying. A petite woman sat lifeless at the wheel. In the back seat was a wicker basket with someone emitting faint squeaks. Edward retrieved the basket. Inside lay a tiny infant. In their panic they took the baby and rushed to their car. Deborah trembled, paralysed with fear. "She's dead," she whispered. "What if they don't believe me? What if they think I was driving wrong? I'll go to jail, Edward. Let's get away from here. I can't. I'm afraid." Edward and Deborah carefully examined the baby on the back seat. It was a girl. Deborah's eyes fixed on the birthmark on the baby's shoulder, a strange geometric triangle on light skin. That moment would be forever seared in her memory. The dark night, the primal fear of blame, the baby's weak cries, their despair. Edward turned to his young wife with the crucial question. "What are we going to do? Take this girl with us?" Deborah hissed. "Are you crazy? What will we tell our parents, our friends, everyone? It will give us away. They'll find me. This accident will ruin my life. Let's get rid of this girl." Edward didn't object, though he seemed unsure how to proceed. Deborah pointed at a road sign and suggested, "It's only 20 kilometres to the nearest town. We'll leave the girl there." They drove in complete silence. The girl fell asleep peacefully in her wicker basket. The dawn began to break. Deborah was terrified that someone would notice and remember them. Everything went smoothly. After crossing the bridge, they found themselves on a pretty embankment with a row of houses lining the river. There was abundant greenery around, rose bushes blooming in gardens behind fences. They parked the car and hurried along the embankment. The town was beginning to wake up. The nicest place, the woman thought to herself. The girl will do well here. Edward followed at his wife's heels, silently carrying the basket with its living cargo. The baby girl slept serenely, unaware that her life was about to change abruptly. They had chosen the finest house, sturdy, with coloured shutters and a red slate roof. It stood out immediately, distinguished by its high, well-maintained fence surrounding the property. The gate was unlocked. Edward and Deborah tiptoed to the house and placed the basket on the top step of the low porch. They fled the yard like rats from a sinking ship, guilt gnawing at their souls. They left the city with heavy hearts, seeing no other option under the circumstances. On the road, Edward declared, "Deborah, this nightmare never happened. Keep quiet and no one will find us. But there are hardly any witnesses, and besides, it was that woman's blame. We should forget this like a bad dream." Though still in shock, Deborah nodded, understanding her entire future hung in the balance. Leaving the crash scene was a felony, let alone being the cause of the tragedy. They never learned that the girl's mother had been a stranger to these parts, fleeing harsh parents who hadn't forgiven her for having a child without a husband. Tomiko's mother, weary of criticism, had secretly taken her grandfather's car to seek a fresh start. Her father had been a chauffeur, and she had driven since age 14. On that ill-fated night, drenched in tears and barely able to see the road, she lamented her unenviable fate, pondering how to move on, and eventually found her doom. A cruel twist of fate. Steve, the baby's future adoptive father, discovered the foundling early that morning. Stepping into his yard, he found the small miracle waiting on his porch. He immediately brought the basket inside to show his wife. Together, they decided to accept this gift from above. Tomiko's foster mother had long delayed having children, paralysed by an intense fear of pregnancy and childbirth. Now she could have a child without facing her fears. Steve showered the baby with compliments. "Look how lovely she is. So cute." His wife caught his enthusiasm. "We'll call her Tomiko," she said. "My mother has a friend by that name. She's been blessed with good fortune her whole life. Our foundling should be equally blessed with that name." They managed to obtain official adoption papers, though not without difficulty. Yet they couldn't love her. They treated their God-given surprise with dutiful seriousness, but something remained missing. They told Tomiko frankly about her adoption, explaining they would raise her to adulthood and then be free of their obligation. They never considered who might care for them in their old age, absorbed instead in travels and pleasures. They provided shelter and help, but no love. The morning after Deborah fainted, she and Edward had a serious conversation. "I barely slept last night, Deborah," he said. "I've thought everything through. Here's my conclusion. Tomiko came to our house like a boomerang that always returns. It's time to pay our debt of heart and soul. Though I haven't abandoned my plan to learn about her past, something tells me it's unblemished. I feel it instinctively. Providence offers us a chance to atone for our sin." Deborah wavered, uncertain. While Tomiko herself didn't repulse her, she wondered how she could live with this constant reminder. She shared her doubts with her husband. "We've lived peacefully for 27 years, he replied. "If things work out between Chris and Tomiko, so be it. You'll need to learn to respect your daughter-in-law at least. Besides, they'll live elsewhere. You know definitely how to maintain appearances, Deborah." Chris was discovering love's new dimensions, learning the art of courtship. He was completely smitten. After work, he'd rush to the country mansion. As golden autumn yielded to cold late fall and then winter, the initially uncomfortable ground became blanketed in dense snow. Tomiko wore her charming red down jacket as they strolled through the village or played snowball fights in the nearby forest. Jokingly, they teased each other about what presents they would put under the tree, each hoping for their own special gift. Meanwhile, Edward, as promised, had obtained information about the young woman's past life. The old story of the accident remained buried. When the tragedy occurred, police found an unknown woman's body in the car, but never found the culprits. They made attempts, of course, but searching on a busy highway was like looking for a needle in a haystack. They identified the deceased and informed her family, but they never mentioned that their daughter might have a baby with her. They showed no interest in the consequences of their daughter's actions. They didn't even mourn their daughter. It was her choice. Deborah began to soften, her fears retreating to a distant corner. Tomiko showed no desire for revenge, maintaining peace with her and taking care of Chris. Deborah could see that Chris was also very fond of his wife. Love works in mysterious ways, as Edward noted. Their son had transformed completely. As New Year approached, Chris mentioned that he and Tomiko hadn't yet had their honeymoon. Pleased that the couple remained together, Edward admitted defeat in the first part of their agreement. He transferred a substantial portion of shares to his heir and approved their winter trip to Europe, where Christmas was always beautiful. Let the young couple rest and enjoy themselves, he thought. Yet Tomiko had her doubts. She didn't even believe in Cinderella stories, being mistreated and then suddenly finding a prince. She feared losing her fragile happiness. The family's wealth didn't tempt her, nor did their luxurious lifestyle, though she admitted the pool was enchanting, being able to swim whenever she wished. But she would trade it all just to be loved for who she was, strengths and weaknesses alike. She had one more magical experience ahead, flying to Europe with Chris. Her passport had been restored, and her supposed husband was arranging her travel documents. Tomiko knew Chris liked her, but she yearned for something more, to hear him say, "I love you." It might seem saccharine and sentimental, but she didn't care. She had grown attached to this young man, who proved to be a real-life knight, rather than a medieval legend. The airplane was humming with noise as tourists eagerly discussed their winter weekend plans. Chris sat quietly lost in thought until he couldn't contain himself any longer. "Tomiko, I need to tell you something. Marry me, for real. I've never felt so strongly about anyone before." The woman smiled gently. "We're already married in everyone's eyes. What's the difference?" Chris wrapped his arm around her shoulders and gazed into her eyes. "I don't want any more pretense in my life. I want to be with the woman I love honestly and truly. In one of the cities on our European tour, they can register our marriage there. Unless you'd prefer something grander, a celebration, a beautiful dress, whatever you want, just give me your answer now." Tomiko felt warm with emotion. After a brief pause, she answered calmly, "Yes, I will be your wife. I don't need ceremony or a white dress. My knight has already saved his lady's heart once. I trust you completely, and I love you too." At that moment, Tomiko realized something extraordinary. Expressing love felt just as magical as hearing it. Somehow she knew this wonderful feeling would sustain her for the rest of her life.